Hey, today we are talking about the woman with the bleeding. Today we're looking at Mark chapter 5, verse 21 through 43, and it's a beautiful story of how Jesus is interrupted on his way to heal someone. And it says this: So Jesus got into the boat again and went back to the other side of the lake, where a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. "My little daughter is dying," he said. "Please come and lay your hands on her, heal her so she can live." That hits home for me. New baby daughter, scary. Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. That really sucked. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them, but she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. She had heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. For she thought to herself, "If I can just touch his robe, I will be healed." Immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him, so he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" Now I love this. The disciples are always like a step behind. They always, I love Jesus because he's so patient with them, but they're clearly a step behind. He says, the disciples said to him, "Look, this crowd is huge. How can you ask who touched me?" And then Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him that what she had done. And he said, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over." The first thing that I love about this story is that even though Jesus is on the way to heal this little girl, he is always ready and available for interruption. He's willing to make room in his life for you. And sometimes as Christians, I think we don't want to ask things of Jesus because we're worried that it's an interruption or an inconvenience. But this story tells us is that Jesus was able to make room in his time, in his life for these type of moments. And there would have been a lot of urgency in this situation. When we read the Bible, sometimes it can not really jump out at us, and we forget the urgency. But Jairus had a daughter who was literally dying. And so Jesus might have been Olympic speed walking over to this house because the urgent situation, but he still was able to make room for this woman and the healing of this woman. Now, you might say, well, that's irresponsible, but I think Jesus had absolute confidence in his Father's ability to heal the little girl, that he knew that he could make room for this woman. Now, I think in our own lives, we need to also be available to interruptions. God will sometimes interrupt our life and say, I need you to go talk to this person, or I need you to go pray for this person, or send this person a text, or give this person a call. And we need to be available to God's interruptions, because sometimes those promptings will be transformational in people's lives. We see this as the woman interrupts Jesus. This interruption was absolutely foundational, transformational for her life. Another thing I see in the story is that Christ knows the needs of an individual. See, this woman, as she touched Jesus' robe, doesn't say, Jesus, I've been struggling with bleeding for quite some time. I've went to the doctors and it just hasn't worked out. If it were in your will, would you be able to heal me of this ailment? No, because Jesus knows her needs. See, in the same way, Jesus knows what we need every moment of every day. And this is so comforting to me as a person, because there are times where I'll be feeling things or need something so desperately, and I know that the only one who knows exactly how I feel, the only one who knows the intimate thoughts that I have, the things that I my most inner needs is Jesus. And Jesus wants to meet those needs. But as we've talked about in this series, Act of God, it requires us to reach out. This woman is reaching out to touch the cloak, and in that time, she was seen as ceremonially unclean. She was seen as an outsider, an outcast. Socially, she was not really supposed to be interacting with Jesus, because if she touched him, then he would have been seen as ceremonially unclean. In the old covenant, there's ways that you would have to sacrifice lambs, goats, all sorts of things, saltwater brines. You did all sorts of different things in order to get pure. because if you were ceremonially unclean, you weren't able to access like the presence of God. And so if she was reaching out, this was socially not cool. This was like religiously not cool, but she did it anyway. She risked her reputation. She risked any shred of dignity that she had left. And she decided that reaching out was worth it. Reaching out was worth it in hopes that Jesus would make her well. And we see that as she reaches out, as it says in James 4, that as we draw near to God, he'll draw near to us. Like her faith was the thing that made her well. And it's so amazing because she was rewarded for her faith. I had issues with my back for many, many years. And like my parents and my family would pray consistently about my back, and it just never seemed to be resolved. Finally, one day it was, but when I think about those times, I wonder if I really had faith that God would heal my back. You know, someone, as we were talking about this at Young Adults, somebody said, like, you know, I might say that I have faith with my words, but in my heart I know that I don't. And I think that's a beautiful reality, and also just being so vulnerable with our words. Like, we often say, oh, absolutely, Jesus, you can move mountains, but in our hearts we don't believe that it can happen. And so our faith needs to be the thing that makes us well. Like, there's the verse in James that says the prayer of a righteous and faithful man will move like mountains. You know, it has power. And we need to have this understanding that our faith is what can make us well. See, with my back issues, like, I know that God moved, but it took me believing that he could move in my life for those to be resolved. As we were recording this video, John and I sometimes take pauses and we talk about like the message, and we just kind of process what's going on. And he reminded me of, like, I'm new at the dad game, but he's kind of in it further along than I am. But when your daughter or your child cries out, you can recognize the cries that your child has. And it's kind of this cool, like, dad mode vibe thing that you got, where if your daughter's just like, for me, if I'm saying daughter because that's what I have, but if my daughter is crying and she's like, meh, meh, it's like, okay, she's fine, she's just whining, like, she just wants my attention. But there's a moment when she cries, and we call it the goat cry in our house because it sounds like a dying goat. But, like, we know that goat cry is a cry of desperation. And I think this woman reaching for the cloak is a cry of desperation, saying, Jesus, I am giving up everything I have just to touch your cloak because I know how desperate I am for you. See, like, this was her only hope. This was her only hope. She had exhausted every other option, and this had become her only hope. That's crazy. It's like in Star Wars when the Empire is coming back in full strength and there are no more Jedi, and Leia sends out a distress call in R2-D2, and it says, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you are my only hope. You are my last resort. But the reality was, for this woman, Jesus was her only hope. But what I absolutely love, is that Christ takes hopeless situations and turns them for good. He takes every hopeless situation and turns it for good. He is our hope. He is our cornerstone. He is our anchor. He is the God of breakthrough, and he is faithful to the end. He is so, so good, and he wants to take your hopeless situation and to turn it around. He wants to bring hope into your situation. The last thing that I love about this story is that as Jesus heals this woman, he says, your faith has made you well. And, like, usually sometimes we, like, stop the story in our heads there. But I love this little thing that he says. He says, now go in peace. Your suffering is over. Go in peace. Your suffering is over. You know, this woman had physical needs and he was suffering physically. But what we don't necessarily always look at is that suffering that she was experiencing physically would have been suffering mentally, emotionally, spiritually. She would have been suffering as a whole person. I imagine that she was full of anxiety, full of depression. I imagine that her mental health was not in a good place. I imagine that her spiritual health wasn't in a good place because she might have felt cursed or whatever. And so when Jesus says, go in peace, he's saying your suffering is over. He's not just saying about your bleeding is over. He's saying, listen, your anxiety, your depression, these things, you have been made well holistically as a person. See, when Jesus restores, he doesn't just restore one aspect of a person. He wants to restore the whole person. He wants to take your hopeless situation and turn it for good. So Jesus, as we are desperate for you, I pray that you would restore us. God, I pray that you would take every hopeless situation in our life and make it for good. God, I pray that you would show up, and we love that you know our every need, and so would you show up in those needs. God, I pray that you would restore, you'd bring hope, and you'd bring faith. Lord, we love you and we're thankful for you. So thank you for joining us online. We'll see you next week. And just a reminder, we are open in the building on Tuesday nights at 7:30. See you there.